Welcome to another episode of DD on the Spot. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Johnson. Before I get to our guest today, I'd like to remind everyone that if you enjoy this content, please give a like and subscribe down below. We greatly appreciate it. We have David Bolton on the podcast. He's a veteran. He's an author. We're going to talk about his short story, A Hike Around the Lake. He's coming to us all the way from Chicago, but most importantly, he's our current guest. David, thank you so much for being on the show.
Good to be here, Ryan.
Absolutely. So why don't you give us a little bit of a backstory on what inspired you to become an author and write this story?
Well, it started a long time ago when I got out of the service in 1968. Had some personal issues for many years with PTSD, nervousness, hyperactive startle response, nightmares, bad dreams, bad memories, anger issues, jealousy issues. I had all kinds of bad things, bad traits. So this went on for a number of years, and I assumed that it's just the way my personality had happened to mature and turn out. But after many years, I decided to look into this and go to the local Veterans Administration hospital for some help. So I've been going there ever since 1987. So it's helped me quite a bit. The psychiatrist, psychologist, very helpful. I've been on a successful cocktail of drugs and anxiety, antidepressants for many years now, and I really can't live without them. There's been a few occasions where I had gaps in my medication, and I became the old person that I wanted to stay away from with the anger and the nervousness and so forth. So I was assigned this new psychologist, a female, and who was interested in my life before I went into the military. While in the military, I spent 2 tours of Vietnam. So that's the reason for my bad traits. So this psychologist was interested in what my life was like, and it took her a year, but she dug out some bad memories that I didn't want to deal with. But she encouraged me to face them, and I learned to face them. And I'm glad I did now, because I had secrets that I swore I'd take to my grave with me, bad memories. So I started writing a memoir, a personal memoir, because inspired by my mother. We never had a very warm relationship. Even when I was a little boy, she was never a warm woman. And I was the last of 6 children. And when I tell people that I'm the youngest, I usually get the same response. Oh, you're the baby. I bet you were spoiled. No, not at all. I was not spoiled. It was not pleasant living with that woman and my stepfather. Anyhow, I decided to write a memoir about her, and an offshoot of that idea was bad memory within a bad memory, which was I was about 10 years old. My mother and I and my older sister and her daughter went up to a resort in Wisconsin, right outside Elkhorn, Wisconsin, for a week or so. And there I was molested by a boy, an older boy that worked at the resort named John. And it's a horrible memory. I never told anyone. No one knew it. I couldn't tell my mother what had happened because my mother didn't like any bad news. And unfortunately, at a young age of 10, I knew not to give her any bad news. It's a shame, but that's how it was. So I kept it within me for deep into my adulthood. And again, getting back to the psychologist, she wanted to know about my life as a youth, and this came out of that. Before I opened up, I asked her how long she'd been treating veterans. She said, about 30 years. I said, well, I bet you heard everything. She said, I've heard it all. Nothing will surprise me. I said, well, I bet I could surprise you. And I told her about what happened at the resort, and she was surprised. But to add to it, I believe that the boy that did this was John Wayne Gacy. And I'll explain why. For those of you who don't know, those of you who are too young, John Wayne Gacy was the most infamous murderer, child molester of young boys in America. He admitted killing 33 young men and boys, and buried them under his garage or under his crawl space of his house. but he was executed in 1994, I believe. And the reason why I believe it was him is because after he was executed, or the eve of his execution, I looked at his face on the TV screen one last time because he had been all over the news for about 15 years. And I said to myself, by golly, I think that was him, the one that molested me, that is. So I made an effort to see what I could find out about Gacy and where he was in his teenage years to try to connect the dots here. And a few weeks after the execution, I called up William Kunkel, who was one of the prosecutors of Gacy. There were several. He was one of them. He was pretty much the main guy. He was on TV most of the time. So I called him up, and as luck would have it, he was in his office and he spoke to me. Just right on the spot. I assumed I'd have to leave a message, and he'd never call me back. But he talked to me immediately, and I told him who I was and why I was calling. And I asked him if, to his knowledge, the research that he had done regarding Casey's background, did he ever work in Wisconsin as a teenager? I didn't say at a resort. I just said Wisconsin. I left that open to see if he would fill me in. I don't want to give him too much rope. He said, yes, indeed, he did research him quite completely. And he did work at a couple of resorts up in Wisconsin as like a gopher, dishwasher, this sort of thing. And that's what his duties were when I was at this particular resort. I said, okay, thank you very much. And we hung up. And to me, that satisfied it. To me, that was good enough for me. And I was pretty sure that this was probably him. And another thing connection, Gacy, that is, on his day off, well, he befriended me. He was about 16, I was about 10. And he was friendly and asked me about baseball and sports and things like that. So he had time off. He took me in a rowboat. We went fishing one day. And I never did that before. That was kind of fun. And another day, he went out for an hour or so, and he taught me how to catch frogs. Frogs are easy to catch as long as you don't make any sudden moves. And there are frogs on the lily pads and so forth. And he caught one. And then he showed me how to do it, and I caught one. But here's the ugly part. He caught a frog, and he took out his knife, and he stabbed the frog. And he made me do it. Horrible memory, just horrible. But I was afraid of him because he told me if I didn't, he was going to drown me. So I complied. So, again, horrible memory. And then he killed a few more, and there's a branch from a tree overhanging the water. So he took these frog carcasses and hung them on their branch. It was a real ugly sight, and wish I could erase it, but I can't. So that was my experience with him, and I went back to the shore. His break was over, and I, again, not being close to my mother at just 10 years old, I couldn't tell her because that would upset her. And mother didn't like to be upset, so I bit my lip. I bit my lip my whole life, really, with that woman. So my mother and I and my sister and her child, we left the resort, and I told myself I couldn't tell anyone. I didn't plan on telling anyone, as it was embarrassing, it was shameful, and a horrible, horrible memory, and that was it. That was my plan, just to bite my lip about it the rest of my life and take it to my grave. But then again, the psychologist at the VA hospital pulled that out, and she was quite surprised that veteran with this past is sitting before her in her office. And out of that, it was all as a whole catharsis to get out of my system and finally tell somebody. And so it was kind of a relief in a way. Today I could say out loud, I was molested as a child. I was always ashamed and embarrassed to even think the words, but I could say that now. And again, I started writing this memoir about my mother, who didn't protect me or didn't keep an eye on me or wasn't wary of an older boy that wanted to spend time with the younger boy. Should have been a red flag, but it wasn't to her. So I decided to write a short story, a fictitious short story, because I wanted to give it a happier ending than my own story, and I did. I gave it a happy ending. And I got many positive reviews from reviewers and readers, and sales have been dismal, but that's okay. I'm an unknown author, so my books aren't on the shelf. You have to go online and so forth to read it, to purchase it. But in the title, you asked me why I named it A Hike Around the Lake. I named it A Hike Around the Lake because before John Gacy molested me, he asked me if I wanted to go for a hike around the lake with him. It wasn't a very big lake, and I said, sure, at 10 years old, and I didn't have anyone to spend time with up there. My mother's on the beach getting her tan, and with my sister, my oldest sister, and her child. So I was kind of like on my own up there. So he said, let's go for a hike around the lake. And I said, sure. And that's when the molestation occurred. So that's the inspiration for the title. And as far as publishing, I didn't know a person in the business at all. So after I had this, after I copyrighted this story, I got a lot of attention from publishers, mostly in New York. And again, I didn't know a soul in the business. I chose the publisher I chose because it really had the most informative brochure. And that's the long and short of it. And it took a few bucks to do it, but I'm glad I did. And that's how that whole thing, start to finish, how it all took place. And I still see my psychologist, and she was very proud of me that I did this, that I had the courage to admit to the world what occurred. And we're friends to this day. And I did give her credit in the back cover of the book.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. So how much of a catharsis was this too, sort of writing it and letting that story go? How much did that help you sort of emotionally in the healing process?
Well, I'm as good as I'm going to get. It did help me just to get off my chest and to admit that it happened. Now I'm not so reserved or sheepish about even saying it. So that was good. But I wish I could not remember it. I wish it never happened, number one, but I wish I could just erase it. But I can't erase it, so this is as good as I could do at this point. It did help somewhat, but so that's where we're at. So I'm an old man now, and I'm happy I did what I did. I'm happy I did what I did.
And now another big part about your story is that you quit high school at 17 and you joined the Navy in 1964. What really inspired you to join the Navy out of all the other branches?
Well, Vietnam was getting more and more serious. Yeah, I didn't give much of a thought to Vietnam. I was very anxious kid. I had no direction. I wasn't an athlete. I wasn't a very good student, to tell you the truth. I was just too unhappy with my home life with my mother and my stepfather. We hated each other. My stepfather and I, we just couldn't stand each other. And he referred to me as the kid, and which I thought was funny. It really didn't bother me because I didn't like him anyway. But I knew I needed some direction. And my father, he encouraged me to go in the military because it would give me some structure, and I'm glad I did. I'm very glad I did. The Navy, well, my dad said, the Navy, you're always going to sleep in warm bed and always have food. And as far as Vietnam, I didn't give it a thought. I didn't. That was something on the other side of the world. I didn't think I was going to be in combat, but we were in combat. But really, my dad inspired me to join the Navy rather than the Army or Marines. So that was the reason for that. My dad was we were very close. My father and I were very close, and they were really two opposite people. My mother and my father. My dad was a very warm, loving guy, and my mother wasn't. And I often wonder how in the world did they get together. But that was the reason for my and when I did go in the Navy and in boot camp, there's a series of tests. There's a hearing test, and of course a lot of physical fitness things. And there was IQ test and math test and clerical test, just test upon test. And most of us weren't used to getting up very early in the morning. We have to get up at like 5:30, eat quickly, and go take your test all day long. You'd be taking these tests. It's very serious. You couldn't horse around like you could in high school. So it's very serious, very controlled. And 95% of us were teenagers. Let's face it. There wasn't too many 20, 21-year-olds in boot camp. There's about 100 per company in boot camp, So, revelation, and after all of these tests that we took, my mother was always telling me how dumb I was, and I'll never amount to anything, and I'll end up being a dishwasher to support myself as an adult. And I believe her. I believe every word. So I was pretty much beaten by the time I was a little boy. Psychologically from my mother. And I do believe, looking back, that she was possibly insane, a little short of a few marbles. She was a mean, heartless woman. I can't emphasize that enough. But among these tests was the IQ test. And the IQ test determines if you're going to, one, get a school in the military, and number two, what kind of school, a more difficult school or a less difficult school, because you had to earn a certain score on your IQ test. Well, what surprised me was I had one of the highest scores in the company, and I thought I was a bonehead. Quite surprised. And then when I was told my score, I immediately thought of my mother, and I thought, if you've given me a little encouragement, maybe I'd have a little self-confidence and could have been a better student and gone on to college and so forth. But too late now. That's what I thought. Well, I'm here 17 in the military, and I scored very, very high on the IQ test in our company, and I was really couldn't be more shocked. So consequently, I got one of the more difficult skills I went to radar school, radar operator, and it's a very interesting job aboard a ship. I liked it a lot. I like my job very much. I don't like being at sea for weeks and months at a time, but the job was very interesting. And when you're a young guy like that, you could do a lot more than you can as an old, established person who is used to charting his own course. Back then, you need discipline. You need to be kicked in the butt occasionally, and you learn how to take it. And so that was it's very exciting, really, because overnight, entering the Navy, overnight, you know you're at an important place. Yesterday you weren't, today you are. And that's how I felt about it. So it was exciting, and it was a little scary, but it was a good scary. You knew at the end something good was going to come at the end of it, as long as you kept your nose clean and worked hard and tried hard. And so that was my experience going into the military at such a young age.
What was your first impression of Vietnam when you first got there?
Well, we boot camp in school was almost a year long, and I was only in for 3 years. So we were scared because one of the ships we were relieving, we passed it, in the South China Sea, had a bullet hole, a big lash from a shell that shot into it. There were no casualties, but it was a bit scary. We were a bit on edge. So our ship had many assignments. Majority of them just to blow up huts and things within about a 9-mile distance from the coast of Vietnam, because the range of the guns are only so far. On a destroyer, I was on a destroyer, so the range of these guns isn't on a battleship cruiser. It's entirely different. They go great distance. The shells go great distances, but a destroyer, the guns are much smaller. They're only 5-inch shells. So, and another duty was we had to go up and patrol the Mekong River Delta on the way to Da Nang. We saw Da Nang. We didn't get off the ship, but the river is fairly narrow. You could see both shores, but the ungodly heat is like something you've never experienced. It was so hot, so humid, and so quiet. And my duties took place in the radar room, which is always dark. It's dark, so you could see contacts on the screen. So the room's got to be dark, otherwise you might miss the contact that glows when it's seen on a radar screen. So it's always dark and cool, because the equipment's got to be cool so it doesn't cool and dry. So we were up the river, and I went outside to see what it looked like. And that's when I mentioned hot, ungodly humid, and so quiet. You heard a few birds, but the quiet was, you just have to wonder. We weren't shot upon here, but we were sitting ducks. we could have very easily been sunk. Had there been the Viet Cong there with armament, they could have been there and just decided not to. We'll never know that answer, but it was scary and eerie kind of scary. The cacophonous silence. I'd have to describe it. So we had duties up there, and then when we relieved the duty there, we went up and down the coast, up to the DMZ and further, up off the coast of North Vietnam. But we kept our distance because we were ordered to. And it was scary, very scary, because in the Marines and Army, people, they could say the same thing about their duties. You could hide behind a tree. Well, in the middle of the ocean, there's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to hide. And we had counterfire, and we had some ugly, bad experiences too that I won't reveal today.
Oh, no problem. But how do you deal with that? I mean, at 18 years old, you kind of have to deal with your own morality. How did you adjust that, or how did you sort of deal with that when you were in Vietnam? Because I can imagine that must be a really hard thing to do.
You don't. Most of us didn't think about it. We worked this minute, this hour, and you don't have time to worry. You're there for a reason. You were taught, you were trained, you do it. If it happens, it happens. But you can't let other things come in your mind when you're there for something. You'll go crazy. And we knew that. We weren't really taught that, but that's the conclusion we all had to come to, because we were there. And there's no quitting your job or walking out. Yeah. To deal with it, you did your job. Put it that way. To deal with it, when you're in the combat zone like that, you never have enough sleep. You're always tired. And when we weren't in battle stations, we were still on high alert in the Vietnam war zone. So you're always sleepy. So you get off a watch. You don't sit there and wonder about mortality. You just don't have time for it. You can't do everything. So you do what you're trained to do. If you're going to think about that, well, you're not worth a damn in the military. If you're just going to think about, woe is me, I'm going to die, you're not doing anyone any good. yourself, your shipmates. So you just have to do what you were trying to do. And I was lucky, and a lot of us were lucky. A lot of us weren't lucky. So that's how. Well, you don't have time to to think about why am I here? Why did I ever do this? You just your brain would blow up if you thought of you could think about it later on, and I knew I would later on, and I did later on. But all in all, I tell you, I am thankful, and I'm proud that I did serve my country. I don't have any regrets, but there's they say when you're looking back, a veteran only remembers the good times, and it's pretty much mostly true.
Yeah. So I have two final questions about that. So what made you decide to do a second tour? Because a lot of people, I mean, especially with the Vietnam War being the way that it was, a lot of people were just so happy just to get that first tour done and never look back. What made you choose to go back a second time?
I didn't choose.
Oh, okay.
It was my decision.
Okay.
It was Uncle Sam's decision. Yeah. And I was only in 3 years. Most of us weren't for 4 years. I was only 17 when I joined, which means I needed my parents' permission, and they gladly signed the dotted line, especially my mother. But no, it wasn't my choice.
Oh.
And they wanted to get their money's worth out of the training they gave me. So after my first tour of Vietnam, a ship came back to the States, and we were only in the States, a month or two. And I got orders to report to a different ship that was going back right away. So that's how that came about. No, it wasn't my choice.
Yeah. But what was your experience also like coming back? Because a lot of people talk about now how veterans were treated very, very poorly when they came back. What was your experience like when you came back home from Vietnam?
Well, I wasn't treated poorly because I didn't hardly even mention that I was a veteran. I was only 20 when I got out. Personally, I was so nervous just dealing with civilian life again. I had a date with a young lady. It was fix up. I said 2 words to her, though, hello and good night. I didn't know how to deal with it right away. Being a civilian and dating like I used to do, and I was just so nervous. And we went downtown Chicago and saw a movie, and I was just I forgot how to talk to people. I was kind of you become like a robot once you're in there, and you're taught all these things, these duties, what to do under the circumstances, and so forth. And I forgot how to socialize. Not that I was all that good to begin with, but this girl was pretty, and I was just so nervous. Hello, good night. And needless to say, no second date.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did have a problem for a while. I really did.
What was that the hardest thing adjusting back to civilian life, or were there any other things that you found really, really difficult with when coming back?
Well, for many years I had the symptoms of the PTSD syndrome, and I would like to explain PTSD. For some people think it's we're faking it, or why didn't other veterans have the same symptoms, conditions, under the conditions that we all were under? Well, there's a simple explanation for that. It's simple, but it took the government psychiatrist a long time to figure it out. Up until the Vietnam War, soldiers, sailors, military people that went off to war went to war and came home by troop transport. These big ships, military ships, that took hundreds and hundreds per ship over to the war zone, over to Korea, over to Vietnam to some degree, but not that much as the previous wars, to Europe, to Africa. And after the war, after their tour of duty was up, they came back on the troop transport. Well, that's a big difference. What I mean by that is coming back from war on these troop transports, all these GIs and Marines, and they have time to relax, let their hair down, and not worry about going off to war again. What they would do for a couple of weeks, they'd be aboard these ships for at least a couple of weeks. is essentially deprogram one another. They would talk about their experiences with in the war and the buddies they lost and the buddies that were wounded, and they were psychoanalyzing one another without even realizing it. So by the time they got back to shore, they were pretty much ready to pick up where they left off. Sure, there's always guys that just can't fully recover from these ugly experiences. With Vietnam, there's the big difference: technology. What I mean by that is troop transports weren't used as much as they were previously. Now they were taken to war zones and returned home from war zones by airplane. And if you think of it, with me personally, I was in the Philippines. My last time I was aboard a ship was in the Philippines. 3 days later, I was in Great Lakes. 3 days later, one airplane took us from the Philippines back to San Francisco. There's two stops in between, and then another airplane took me back to Chicago, and I was discharged up at Great Lakes, Illinois. So we didn't have that deprogramming time, if you will. Didn't have it. So it's especially bad, I would think, for the ground soldiers, the Marines and Army guys. One day they're in the jungle. A couple days later, they're at in their kitchen back home eating mom's oatmeal or mom's meatloaf, and they didn't have that deprogramming time that is really very essential. And that's why so many Vietnam guys were late in dealing with their problems. And that's why there's so many Vietnam guys homeless, jobless. They didn't have time to readjust. And again, it took a long time for the shrinks to figure this out, but that's the problem we have now. Now it's changed as far as treatment and so forth. There's a lot of treatment for these guys. But it's the same thing with me. We had some really scary occurrences aboard ship and bad memories. But you have to deal with it sooner or later. It's going to eat you up if you don't. I don't know anyone that can exist to their fullest without dealing with these conditions, especially at such a young age. Sooner or later, the chickens are going to come home to roost. With me, it took about 20 years, and a young lady I knew noticed these symptoms in me. And she had some background in psychology, psychiatry, and encouraged me to go to the VA hospital to see if I could learn how to calm down and not be so snappy and so forth. So that started everything. And it really started from that. The short stories written, and I feel much better. And I have, like I said before, a very satisfying cocktail of medicine that I take, and I seldom get angry anymore. So that's really why so many Vietnam era servicemen had big problems.
Yep.
But now the VA hospitals know how to deal with it now, and after it was finally discovered, and so they're doing the right thing now, I believe.
Yep. So at what point, I mean, how long did it take you to write the book? How long was that process? Was it sort of a few weeks, or did it take you a little bit longer? What was the time frame like?
Well, yeah, the time frame was a few months. I maybe 4 months, something like that. Because once I got the idea, I was really, really hell bent on doing it, because it was something that had to be told to me. I mean, I didn't have delusions of grandeur of being famous or anything. I just had to do it for myself. So by the time I put it down on paper, had it edited, a friend of mine's a professional editor, so she looked it over, edited it for me, and I sent it off to New York for the publishing phase. And the whole process took maybe 6 months. So, but I was really on it. I was doing it. I was writing every day and correcting it every day and try to get a real interesting read out of it. And like I said earlier in the the interview here, I gave it a happier ending
Yeah.
than my own personal story, but it's closely based on my youth, and I was the protagonist in the story.
Had
Yeah.
you ever at any point prior had any other experience writing stuff, or was it just one of the things that you just said, "Hey, I should really write a book out of this," and I just sort of, I'll just go with the flow and see what turns out?
Yes, that was it. I did write something before, but I never had anything published. My nephew is a professional author, and we wrote a screenplay several years ago, and didn't try very hard to get it noticed. We had our other lives going on, but I always liked ideas to be put on paper, and I've always had a lot of ideas about things. I wrote several songs and poems and this sort of thing. But as far as publication, no, this is the one I really wanted to go forward with and have published. And so I think maybe had I had a happier youth, I may have been done it more actively and maybe gone professional to some degree with it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a favorite author or a favorite book that comes to mind?
Well, I like I like the eerie and the unexplainable. I like paranormal stuff. So Stephen King, I like him. I like his stuff. However, my opinion, I think his best stuff isn't the crazy stuff. I think his best stuff is the Green Mile,
Mm-hmm.
Shawshank Redemption,
Yep.
Misery,
Mm-hmm.
Dolores Claiborne,
Yep.
stuff that is more believable. Put it that way. But I like scary things.
I was gonna say, yeah, his It is way too long. That would take me probably about half a lifetime to read that thing. That book is like 1,400 pages or something like that. And
Mm.
I don't know how he got it done and how he turns out books like that so quickly. I mean, it's a mystery to me. I think everyone should, find out his secrets because it truly is amazing. But are you planning on writing anything else now? Have you sort of caught the writing bug where you want to do future books or short stories?
Well, if there's a calling for it, yeah, I would like to. But so far, there hasn't been much of a calling
Yeah.
for. Yeah, like I said, the sales are dismal. But again, I didn't write it to get rich. But I'm not terribly surprised or disappointed because no one's ever heard of me. So I'm not gonna. I don't lose any sleep
Yeah.
over it. Believe me.
Are there any topics that you would think of that you would like to go over for a next book? Have you already sort of thought about that?
Well, I have. In fact, I did write something else, a follow up to A Hike Around the Lake. However, and it's all ready to go, but it's entirely fiction. There's nothing. See, the protagonist, Thomas, becomes a poor man's superhero. He becomes an anti-bully, and I did write a follow up. It's called Caesar's Ghost. And again, if there's calling, if there's a desire out there, which so far there hasn't been, yeah, it would be fun. It would be a fun, constructive way of spending my twilight years.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'll leave a link down below for all that for everyone to go and check it out. I highly recommend it. I read it. He sent me a copy, and it really, really is great. Everyone should go and give it a read. But what are some other hobbies that you like to do other than being an author? What do you get your joy out of now these days?
Well, I exercise probably 6 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
I have a circle of friends at the health club that I go to, and it's if I couldn't do that, I would really be lost. I'll tell you, because the another good therapeutic way of dealing with life is exercise,
Yep.
and I do it religiously, and it's not an effort. I never think, oh boy, I have to go to the gym today. I look forward to it. I really do, because again, I have a lot of friends there, and we all it's kind of like the deprogramming thing that I mentioned. We all kind of help one another and spot one another, and we have personal friendships, and that's really that takes about 3 hours a day out of my life.
Wow.
And I have several cats. I love cats. I started taking cats in. Been alone for many years, and I fed one day 15 years ago, and the rest,
Yeah.
and the word gets out in the cat community. And I never had a cat before, and now I love them. I go to bed, they lay next to me, and they're a big part of my life.
I mean, I used to visit my grandpa's farm, and they had about 100 cats there. So yeah, I know that they all just flock around, and yeah, that can get to be a hassle sometimes. But yeah, cats are great. But what is your favorite thing about living in Chicago, and what is your least favorite thing about living in Chicago?
Well, Chicago's got some terrific restaurants. I like to I like fine dining. I like to eat good try out new restaurants and things. And let's see, I'm not crazy about winter anymore. When I was a kid, but now it's not what it used to be. And the good thing about Chicago is it's a hub for transportation. So that's the nice thing about living in Chicago. And my intention is to liquidate and move to North Carolina. I like North Carolina quite a bit in the western part of the state, and I've been going down there for a number of years now, about 20 years. And but I'm stuck here right now with some inventory, my real estate inventory that it's slow to sell.
Yeah.
So, but once I wrap all that up, I'm gonna head out to Asheville, North Carolina.
I was gonna say my other grandpa, he used to live in Raleigh for probably about 20 years, God's country, and yeah, it's some of the most beautiful country that you could probably ever see. I mean, it's a huge destination, and anyone, if you're even in the area or if you want to, if you're gonna take a tour, you got to go through North Carolina, especially during the fall. I mean, it's so beautiful there. It's definitely a place to be. But now I always like to ask every guest that I have on this podcast, if you could go back in time and talk to the 18-year-old version of yourself, what would be the best piece of advice you would give him?
Let's see here. Don't listen to mother. Mother was bad. Mother was bad for me. But if you don't think you can, maybe you can. If you don't think you can do it, keep at it. Look for your talents, and beware of older kids that want to befriend you. Beware, especially if you're little like I was. And my mother should have seen that. She should have seen that. But again, look for your talents, and look for your. If you think you're dumb, well, there's something you can do better than most. Just explore it, find out what it is. That's my advice to 18-year-olds.
And also with the whole John Wayne Gacy thing, did that bring a little amount of closure to it, knowing that he did get executed and that he's not still roaming free and doing that to other people? Or was it just one of those things where you still need to really find out who he was before, just to confirm that?
Well, no, I come a little closer putting the dots together. Can I prove it without doubt? No, I can't. But I'm trying to do so. I'm trying to. I've been making calls. I've been trying to find people that were around then. But unfortunately, this is later in my life, and he was executed a long time ago. It's hard to do right now. And if I don't, I don't. But I do believe, without being able to prove it, it was him, because of not only what he did, but the thing with the animals. Oh Lord.
Yeah, no sane person would ever do that. Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. And honestly, we cannot thank you enough for coming on and sharing your story. I mean, it's so great to hear from people, especially authors and especially veterans, because a lot of people, it just seems like in our society, as soon as veterans come home, we sort of tend to, as a society, try to forget them as soon as they come home and they have their parades, and then it's like, oh, hey, you're back. And then we don't realize the impact that everything has on them for the rest of their lives, where we just tend to see only when they're in the uniform and in service. We don't realize, what they go through. I mean, we had a homeless veteran when I drove to work all the time that would be out there, and I'd stop by and give him money all the time. And it's just, we really need to definitely take care of that problem. And again, we cannot thank you enough for having you on to share. And everyone, A Hike Around the Lake, I'll leave the link down below where you can go and buy it. Again, I highly recommend it. And David, is there anyone that you would sort of like to give a shout out to, or anyone that you'd like to, recommend before we wrap things up here?
Well, on a personal note, May Sundberg, she's a psychologist that pulled it out of me that no one else could. No one on this earth was able to do it, but she was. May Sundberg at the Hines VA Hospital in Maywood, Illinois. I salute you, May. Thanks so much.
All right, absolutely. And again, you guys, Hiker on the Lake, go and check it out. And David Bolton, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really, really appreciate it, and I wish you nothing but the best in your and for the rest of your life. I mean, just being your backstory. I mean, I cannot thank you enough for coming on, and you were just such a great guest. And everyone, this is Ryan Johnson, DD on the Spot, signing out. Have a great day, everyone.